Hello everyone, this is Darian of GNB Productions, and today we'll be taking a look at Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a live-action adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim series of graphic novels written by Brian Lee O'Malley. The story revolves around 23-year-old Scott Pilgrim, once finding the literal girl of his dreams, finds himself having to fight her 7 evil exes in order to be with her. For real this time. The reason I had that as my intro to my Scott Pilgrim Takes Off video was to maintain the show's illusion that it was a retelling. Not gonna lie, I was still riding the high of that show after its release, so I couldn't help myself but to talk about the film adaptation. In the few months since I've watched the show, I have gone and read the graphic novel, both in preparation for this video and for the sole fact that I was still riding that Scott Pilgrim high. The graphic novel is honestly amazing. I love this movie, as I will get into, but it really doesn't do the comic story justice. This video is going to be a bit tricky for me, because when I planned on making this video, I completely intended on reviewing this movie solely on how it operates as a film. Those who have tuned into the channel before know that for me, when it comes to adaptations, I like to view how well they work as a movie first and foremost. I did it with the Sonic movies, I did it with the FNAF movie, and I was totally set on doing it with Scott Pilgrim. But I'd be lying if I said that reading the comic in its entirety didn't change how I viewed the movie ever so slightly. And considering that this will likely be the only time I can share my thoughts on the original Scott Pilgrim story, I've decided that one half of this video will be me doing my usual thing of how well this movie functions on its own merits, while the other half is going to be me expressing my thoughts on how the movie fares as an adaptation and where it kinda stumbles for me. Okay? Cool. The story of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is nearly one-to-one with the original comic, and because of that, I find it to be absolutely amazing. The style of writing that Brian Lee O'Malley implemented into the books was brought over brilliantly into the film. There is a lot to take away from this movie, but one of the biggest things is how consistently hilarious it is. I can't even attempt to do the film's writing justice, you just have to watch it for yourself. I will, however, provide you with my favorite moments.
You're thinking of juggling 2 chicks.
Not even.
Well, you should break up with your fake high school girlfriend.
Wait, who told you?
Wallace, duh.
He's not even conscious.
Whatever. You were...
And that's a cut. Scott! Evil X! Fight.
Hey. Excuse me.
Your hair's getting shaggy.
Yeah?
So,
He's just a really nice guy. We're gonna get brunch next week. We actually have a lot in common.
your hair is getting really shaggy.
It is?
Yeah.
You once were a vegan, but now you will be gone.
Vegan.
It meant nothing. I didn't think it would count.
It meant nothing?
I was just a little bi-curious.
Well, honey, I'm a little bi.
Is Scott here?
You know what? He just left.
Really?
Yeah.
The very nonchalant kind of vibe the comic had with a lot of its characters and story beats is so freaking fun. I can't think of a single joke in this movie that doesn't end up landing one way or another for me. It's so great. The basic premise alone is so freaking nuts. A dude having to fight a girl's 7 evil ex-boyfriends in order to be with her is fucking bananas, and I love how the story holds nothing back from it. When I heard that premise from a few friends of mine who recommended the movie a few years back, you can imagine my surprise at the batshit insanity this movie encompasses. The visual and editing style is also something that can be praised about it as well. The heavy video game influences of the comic were a major highlight when brought to screen. The world of Scott Pilgrim is so damn interesting, and the way this film in particular chooses to ease you into it, I find to be pretty fun. To briefly bring up the comic, they made it a point to show that Scott had a background in fighting, so in the eventual fight with Matthew Patel, it really isn't that jarring. I like that the movie took the approach of having things be super stylized but relatively low-key and down to earth, only for it to take a massive tone shift with the introduction of Patel. I'll be honest and say that other than the very funny and witty writing, Plot-wise, this movie doesn't have anything more to go by. It's a very what you see is what you get kind of plot, but it is brilliantly elevated with its phenomenal directing and godly editing. This kind of story needed someone who has a very distinct kind of directing style, and Edgar Wright was such an inspired choice. His style of quick paced editing has been celebrated, rightfully so, for ages, and having him be the one to bring the world of Scott Pilgrim to life was fucking brilliant. The very snappy and quick transitions are absolutely superb, as well as the overall execution on the video gaming elements as well are just great. If you also can't already tell, video games are at the very core of Scott Pilgrim's identity. Throughout the movie, there are a lot of cool sound cues, visual gags, the way Scott progresses from each evil X is akin to that of a boss fight throughout a game, etc. You get the point. The video game motif was handled brilliantly in this movie. And it's even more prevalent in the super well choreographed and stylized action sequences. Every fight in this movie is so much damn fun. The opening with Patel was a great first impression. Not to get into any of the comic shit, but Ramona fighting Roxy by puppeting Scott around was a neat way of adapting bits of the Free Comic Book Day issue. The fight between Scott and Lucas Lee's stunt doubles was fucking hilarious. One of my faves throughout the whole movie. The final fight with Gideon and Knives is so much fun. It's impossible to get bored watching this movie. But where this movie and Scott Pilgrim as a whole shines is undoubtedly in its characters. Each character in Scott Pilgrim is absolutely amazing. From the major to the minor, I'd go as far as to say that this movie has no bad character in it. The characters are all interesting, as this story, while simple, is extremely character driven. Every character in some way serves a purpose. So let's start things off with our titular, Scott Pilgrim. Scott Pilgrim's arc throughout the story is a pretty damn good one. Throughout the film, you see that this dude who is super charming, funny, dorky, and shit is kind of an asshole. The way he treats his high school girlfriend, and no, I don't mean the girl he dated in high school, even though he's not the nicest to her either. I mean the literal high schooler this grown-ass man is dating. Alright, I feel the need to bring this up because, yeah, we like to joke about it and shit, but let's get things straight. No, Scott Pilgrim is not literally a P3DO. He was only dating, I'm saying this in quotations, Knives as a rebound for his relationship that ended the year prior. He holds no genuine romantic or physical attraction to her. I've seen so many people try to dog on the story for having Scott date a high schooler as if, like, that's not one of the major things that gets called out throughout the story. Almost every member of Scott's personal friend group consistently calls him out for dating Knives. It's not something that's, like, glorified or anything. Like, the story makes it a point to say, hey, this guy, kind of a fucking weirdo. He shouldn't be doing this. He's kind of a piece of shit for doing this. It especially gets worse as he essentially dumps her at the turn of a hat as soon as he sees Ramona, who, trust me, we will get into later. But the most compelling part of the Scott Pilgrim story is watching the life of this scummy and bummy ass dude and watching him learn to better himself as a person. That said, it could have been handled better. I'll go more into this when discussing the comic side of things, but the film's very nonchalant writing style leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to Scott's progression as a character. Like in the climax, we breeze through Scott apologizing and reconciling with his friend group, and on one hand, it works because writing-wise, it's very consistent with how the rest of the movie has presented itself, but on the other hand, it still leaves a bit more to be desired for me. Same kind of goes for the movie's secondary protagonist, Ramona Flowers, the literal girl of Scott's dreams, who has a mysterious past with the 7 evil X's. Throughout the movie, she's a bit of a boring character. Now, I don't think she's bad, just the kind of stoic and distant personality type got a little old for me as the movie went on. Even though it does kind of make sense for her to be this way because of the whole evil X's thing, but the movie dabbles in trying to center around two very problematic individuals. But when it comes to Ramona, she's significantly less developed than Scott, and that's kind of saying something. The two do have pretty good chemistry together, but Ramona always just felt a little bit lacking for me personally. Every other character doesn't get that much time to shine, but I think that level of simplicity works for them. Characters like Kim, Stephen Stills, young Neil work very well with the simplicity of the movie's writing. Same goes for everyone else, like Knives, Envy, the X's, etc. All don't get that much individual character focus, but it's really telling how much of an impact they all leave with all of their addicting charm. Another thing this movie needs praise for is its absolutely phenomenal cast. I'm not kidding when I say every casting choice was literal perfection. Apparently, Michael Cera's casting back in the day was a bit controversial amongst fans of the comic, with Scott being a bummy ass loser but still managing to be charming and somewhat likable. Yeah, I think Cera was a great choice for that. He's definitely one of those castings like Hugh Jackman's Wolverine or RDJ's Iron Man, where he's so perfect in the role, I can't imagine anyone else pulling it off as well as he does. Mary Elizabeth Winstead was also pretty good as Ramona. Writing wise, the movie doesn't do her any favors, but performance wise, she does a pretty decent job. The cast overall is pretty star studded. I don't think any of these guys were huge names back then as they are now, like Chris Evans and Brie Larson, who are probably my faves throughout the whole movie. Ellen Wong brilliantly personified Knives. Jason Schwartzman was great as Gideon. Kieran Culkin literally stole every single scene with Wallace. Overall, this cast was just brilliant. I can't think of a single bad casting choice. They were all great. Overall, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World as a movie is pretty damn fun. It has great characters with interesting character progression, namely for its main lead. The cast all did an absolutely phenomenal job. The comedy and overall writing is absolutely superb. The action sequences are all top notch, and it's all brought together with absolutely phenomenal editing that gives the movie its brilliantly unique flair. And the video gaming elements were brilliantly implemented as well. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World just kicks ass. Now, as an adaptation, on the other hand, yeah, after reading the comic, it kind of soured my view on the movie ever so slightly. As a movie on its own, it's still fantastic and definitely worth a watch, but one problem with how the film adapts the story of the comic has to do with one thing: the lack of sincerity. Yeah, the comic starts off pretty goofy and comedic and is still pretty much so all throughout, but when it comes to depicting Scott's growth as a person and his relationship with his friends, Ramona, etc., the movie shows a significant lack of sincerity. Now, the very nonchalant writing style the movie has with its characters and story is still entertaining as hell, without a doubt, but I can't help but find myself disappointed with the end result, especially with how the story ends. Now, I'm not just going to throw a bitch fit about it not being one to one with the source material. I encourage adaptations to experiment and do their own thing more often than not. But it just sucks that most folks won't be able to experience the way the story in the comic brilliantly wraps itself up. Now, first of all, to get a few stuff off my chest, it really sucks how in both adaptations the Ketty and Nagi twins literally don't have jack shit to do. In the comics, their fights with Scott are treated as more background gags at first, but the more the story progresses, they're the ones that eventually install the doubt in Scott's mind that his relationship with Ramona will work out. I'm just a little disappointed they get so little to do in the adaptations we've received thus far. I as well am a little bothered with how Kim was implemented into the story. Kim Pine is arguably one of the most important figures in the Scott Pilgrim story, because she's one of the many examples of how Scott's idiotic, selfish, and absent-minded nature can really end up screwing others over in the long run. The movie barely goes over Scott and Kim's relationship, and how in the comic, them breaking up in the way they did really left her with a lot of issues. TLDR, Scott and Kim dated in high school, but eventually Scott and his family had to move away to Toronto, so they were kind of forced to break up. We see flashbacks through Scott's POV of him telling Kim that he has to leave, but the motherfucker didn't even tell her. He told their mutual friend Lisa, who I'm really disappointed hasn't been in either adaptation, but it is what it is. She had to learn from someone else that her boyfriend had up and left her. Needless to say, that's kinda fucked up. And in the movie, the only thing alluded to their past relationship is this.
Little lady killer wannabe jerky jerk.
It's completely untrue.
That time with Lisa.
That was a misunderstanding.
That time with Holly.
That wasn't what it looked like.
That time you dumped Kim.
Okay, me and Kim are all good now, all right?
Whatever. Ramona's.
What about you and Kim?
Me and Kim? I can barely remember. It was high school. She had freckles.
That's it?
Yeah, it kind of ended. We changed.
Scott's character in general in this movie has been kinda watered down. Not significantly, but enough to where it's noticeable that they really didn't go all in with depicting him as this aloof asshole, and his overall character arc really takes a hit because of it. The best way I could talk about this is going over Nega Scott and his role in the story. In the movie, Nigga Scott is basically Gideon's trump card after being defeated. It's meant to be slightly symbolic of Scott dealing with his issues, but it's not direct enough for my liking. Anyway, in the end, they basically become best friends and it's treated as just a gag. In the comic, however, Nega Scott is the manifestation of all of Scott's past mistakes and choices. He tries to ignore all his problems by killing Nigga Scott, but ultimately realizes, thanks to Kim, that in order to truly better himself, he has to accept all the terrible things he's done and the people he's hurt, by literally accepting that part of himself. Now, both things technically occur in the movie and comic, but like I mentioned before, the movie shows a significant lack of sincerity compared to the source material. A lot of these issues also kind of stem from the fact that this script was written when the comic story wasn't even finished. But regardless, I still think it dropped the ball with a lot of these aspects. The way they handle Ramona's character as well kind of bothers me too. I mentioned that in the movie she's kind of boring, and that's tenfold compared to the comic. She's way more lively personality wise, to the point where the chemistry she and Scott share in the comic is way more believable than how it's handled in the movie. It especially sucks that a good portion of her development in the book features her leaving Scott for a period, not to be with Gideon like the movie did. She just went on a little sabbatical to clear her head and realized that she's dabbled in being a bit of a bitch as well with a lot of her exes, and that she's an extremely flawed person. She ultimately comes back, her and Scott work together to defeat Gideon, and in the end, they just promise to work to be better for themselves and each other. In comparison to the movie, Scott and Ramona getting together feels significantly less earned. Overall, as a movie, Scott Pilgrim is great, no doubt about it, but it significantly drops the ball at adapting the absolutely amazing character-driven and emotional narrative Brian Lee O'Malley created. It sucks that not many people will experience the story for what it truly is. There was a lot more I could go into on how the characterizations for those like Lucas Lee and how I think Steven Still's character was done a bit dirty in both adaptations, but I think it's best to stop here for now. Funny enough, since reading the comic, although I liked the movie slightly less, I ended up loving the anime slightly more. Everything I said in that video still holds true, but it's just nice to view it with the lens of knowing where future Ramona and Scott end up. Whether it's anime, movies, comics, video games, etc., Scott Pilgrim just kicks ass. So, with all that said, if you agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video, let me know right down there in the comments below. Also, be sure to like and subscribe. This is Darion of GNB Productions, and take care.